listening to The Sower, a podcast of the Ciceronian Society. The Ciceronian Society is a community of Christian scholars and public intellectuals committed to the examination of three core themes: tradition, place, and things divine, and their role in a civilization built upon the principles common to the traditions of historic Christianity. To learn more about us, our events, the podcast, our journal, Pietas, to sign up for our newsletter and make your tax-deductible gift, please go to ciceroniansociety.org. That's ciceroniansociety.org. I'm Josh Bowman, Vice President of the Ciceronian Society, and before introducing our guest, please join me in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we pray, O Lord, that you would bless our conversation, and that all we say and do in these few minutes we have together would bring glory and honor to you. Amen. We're recording this on the morning of Thursday, July 7th, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest today, Professor Brent Waters, who was something of a celebrity back at our 2022 conference in Grove City. He stepped in quite late to fill in for a panelist who couldn't make it, and he did not disappoint. He also just retired as Professor of Christian Social Ethics at Garrett-Evangelical Seminary. Brent is the author or editor of dozens of books, and I'll try and provide a few examples in the show notes. I'm not going to list them all right now, but they all sound really, really interesting. And the topic of today's podcast, though, is his most recent book, published just back in May, I believe. It's called Common Callings and Ordinary Virtues, Christian Ethics for Everyday Life, published by Baker Academic. Brent provides a thoughtful and accessible reflection on the everyday relationships and activities, on the ordinary and the boring, which nevertheless point towards things divine, as Cicero said it, a key phrase for us here. So welcome, Brent. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Now, in the preface, you write, quote, "The real world is not extraordinary, but it is where we are called to love God and neighbor. And that love is known and expressed, given and received, most often in unexceptional ways in the routines and patterns of daily life," end quote. It's also a book about human flourishing. So I want to get started here by just asking, what do you mean by ordinary in this book? And why take the time to write about it?
Well, to me, it struck me that as I was coming closer and closer to retirement, that I realized that as someone trained in moral theology, I spent most of my time thinking about very big issues and extraordinary things, and then realized that I had really very little firsthand encounters with what I was thinking about. Most of my time was spent in very ordinary activities, very day-to-day kinds of things. And what I started thinking about is maybe this is a way that we fulfill the second great commandment of loving our neighbors. Because how we express that love of neighbor is oftentimes meeting very basic physical and material needs on a day in and day out basis. And consequently, I realized I overlook maybe the things that are most formative in the Christian moral life. That is just, a glass of water to someone who's thirsty, taking care of a child when she's sick, of just going through those things that are required for us to really be who we are, is very much, most of our lives are lived in very ordinary and routine ways. And I thought maybe it's time to start thinking about that and to start reflecting upon it as someone who claims to know something about Christian moral theology.
That's excellent. It kind of reminds me of the book Liturgy. What's it called? The Liturgy of the Ordinary. And these ordinary things that we do every day that we take for granted, that just kind of get in the way, obstacles, necessities of the little things we do. They're not necessary evils. They're necessary virtues and opportunities. And with that in mind, when you're writing this, maybe this is too broad of a question, but do you have a specific audience in mind when you're writing this? I mean, in a way, it sounds like you're writing it to people like you who have focused on a lot of the extraordinary, but who have missed or have realized that they were overlooking the ordinary in everyday life.
It's a good question, because I really didn't have someone in particular in mind. Mm-hmm. Maybe I was looking in the mirror primarily. I think, though, that one of the challenges of writing about this is that because I go out of my way to try to explain the book, what I'm talking about is something that is just inherently not interesting. In fact, it's mind-numbingly boring. And that really presented a challenge to write about, because if you make it too interesting, then it's no longer formative, because it's in the sheer tediousness that I think we learn something. And yet, if you write something that's so boring no one reads it, then you won't make your point. So how do you write about something which is inherently mundane and yet make it just interesting enough for the reader to want to read it? And that was the challenge. So I guess my audience is essentially anyone who spends time in the ordinary routines of life, which is just about everybody. So I just didn't have anyone in particular in mind.
And that's probably the best way to go about this, because you're reading this book, and I just finished it. I love it, and it's something. There is something for everybody, because these are the everyday things that we do. There's nothing in here that doesn't apply to virtually anyone that you talk to. The book is divided into 3 sections. The first part goes with some theological themes and kind of background questions. The next part deals with relationships, and the final part deals with activities. I want to talk a little bit about the theological themes here then. And there's so many things we could talk about here. We're not going to get to all of them. But how do you distinguish in particular, because it's in the title, I wanted to bring this up. You make a distinction between callings and vocations. Now, what's the importance of that distinction for what you're trying to do in this book?
Well, I think what I was trying to say is that the two are actually intricately related, not necessarily synonymous, but intricately related. And what I mean by that is that I think there's a tendency within popular thought to make a sharp division that the so-called more honorable or higher professions, such as medicine, ministry, and the like, are callings, where everyone else simply has a vocation that you can learn for skills. What I really want to say is, no, everyone has a calling. And therefore, everyone has certain kinds of vocational skills that go with that calling. So, for example, to be called to be a father, for example, it means you have to learn how to change diapers. That's part of your vocational skill in your calling to be a father.
But do we have to? I mean, just kidding.
Well, yeah, I think we do.
All right.
Distressing as that may be, I mean.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, I wasn't going to say anything, but yeah, I mean, calling and vocation. So, I mean, you're not saying that changing diapers is a vocation, but a calling might be that you have to do those little things like changing diapers.
Right. I mean, it is part of the chest of skills that you need to learn. Just like if you want to be a minister, you have to learn which end of the baby to baptize. You have to learn, how to preach, how to provide pastoral counsel. Those are what I would call vocational skills that go with your calling to ministry.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of changing diapers, and perhaps this is a good segue to this, a key term that I also noticed in early in the book was the idea of unselfing. And when you're changing diapers, your mind, you realize you don't matter as much. I mean, you matter to that child, but you think of yourself in this very high, at least I'm speaking to myself now, in this kind of high and mighty way. And now I'm changing a diaper. But at the same time, there is something beautiful about that. And that concept of unselfing, which I think you take from someone else, if I remember. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I use the concept as Iris Murdoch talks about it in both her philosophy and her novels, and she really borrows the concept from Simone Weil. Mm-hmm. And I think Iris Murdoch writes, I think, one of the most memorable lines in 20th century moral philosophy when she says, in effect, the great enemy of moral excellence is the fat, relentless ego, because it gets in the way of everything. And therefore, one needs to unself to begin to understand what is the good or the need of the neighbor, of the other. And therefore, unselfing is a way of putting the ego on a diet, of really shrinking it so that you can be really attentive to the other person to discover the goods and the needs. And exactly what you're saying. I mean, when a baby has fouled his diaper, the good right then is to change it. And one has to be attentive to that and not let the ego get in the way of, I'm a highly educated theologian, why do I have to change this? it's really, that's how you are loving and serving that neighbor in need who happens to be your son or daughter as an infant. So I think it's a way of really saying, it's not that the self is unimportant, but the self can only be understood in relationship to others, and that means sometimes, in fact, a good part of the time, you have to shrink that ego to really understand what is the good of the other.
It's a beautiful concept. Reminds me of John the Baptist, of course. I must decrease that he may increase, and in many ways, I must decrease that the other may increase. In that respect, it's a beautiful idea. Another very Ciceronian theme in this book also is that of place. And place comes up at several different times in the book. And again, this is a big question, but as in terms of the ordinary and these common callings, what role did place have in your thought process as you were writing this?
Place became increasingly important because I realized that as physical and material beings, you have to be in place somewhere all the time. And it really defies kind of the cultural myths that you don't need to be anywhere in particular. Well, you still are in some place. I mean, everyone is still someplace in particular. So there's a need, I think, to begin to value what is that place. And this is how we belong with each other, at least this side of eternity. So how do you take care of place? And that, I think, is becoming an increasing challenge in what I would characterize as a nomadic society, where we think really we can be free of place. So because we can do everything on screens or we can do everything remotely. And I think ultimately that's just a fiction, that we have to be very attentive to the places where we belong with one another. So there is that chapter in which you talk about, the value of taking care of a house, because, people reside there and a house is demanding of attention to maintain it. Maintain even simply the cleanliness of it. And I think we live in an era where we need to be more attentive to the importance of place as being formative. And it's both important foreground and background of moral formation, and deserves much more attention. So that's why increasingly I'm reading writers like Wallace Stegner. I know I need to return to Wendell Berry if I'm going to maintain a good membership in Ciceronian Society, and really beginning to learn about what does it mean to take place seriously.
I'm in, as I was telling you earlier, I've been between moves right now, or I'm in between jobs, so I'm moving from one state to another, and it's striking how much that sense of place becomes apparent. As you're cleaning up a house, and you're looking at, the things you've done there, the mark you've made, the attention you paid to this, or the neglect you've paid to other parts, or the fact that you're also leaving something stable and wanting to land somewhere, a place that you can get more connected to. We've been here 4 years. We moved, as a lot of academics have to do, especially earlier in their career. We move a lot, and this longing for, I just want to stay in one place so I can get to know the ordinary stuff, to feel like a local, right? I know reading some of these things in your book about neighbors and strangers and place and play. It made me think of my childhood when I was in the same town for most of my, for all of my childhood, actually. And that sense of place is so valuable for appreciating and becoming more attentive to your neighbors and where you're at. Moving, I think, from one place to another certainly brings that to the forefront, for better or worse. I want to just switch to part 2 now. Part 2 of the book focuses on everyday relationships, such as that with neighbors, friends, spouses, parents, children, strangers, and citizens. And you've carefully nuanced the way those categories differ and how they overlap. But I want to ask first, which of these categories for relationships did you find the hardest to elaborate on? And behind this question, I should say, is the observation about that when you're writing about the ordinary and about the things you're writing about, it's particularly challenging because of how much you're already in it, in a sense. Like it's hard to objectify the familiar, to analyze it the way you have. And I'm wondering, of these relationships you were talking about, which ones or one did you find the hardest to write about and think through?
That's really a good question because, in a sense, they were all difficult when you start thinking about them. I mean, I found that the concept of thinking about neighbors, I thought I was very clear about it until I started thinking about it.
Yeah, right.
And let me begin first of all with the preface. What I really wanted to do early on was kind of explode the myth that we have a very limited range of neighbors. No, in fact, the range of neighbors, I think, it's an ocean of neighbors, and I use that kind of Bardian structure of talking about neighbors near and far, neighbors who are friends, neighbors who are enemies, and all of them have a kind of regard, but they need to be treated differently because they're a different kind of neighbor. But I think in answering your question more directly, the most challenging for me was citizen. Because what is it? Citizens, that's a very interesting concept because it's one of the few involuntary relationships that we have, other than say something like family. Like in family, you don't choose your parents, certainly don't choose your siblings, and yet you're bound together. Same thing with citizens. We don't choose each other.
Right.
But we're bound together. And what does that mean? Because I think increasingly we live in a world which believes that my range of relationships should be a matter of choice. And that really then destroys the notion, I think, or at least corrodes the notion then of how are we in relationship with people in which we are in severe disagreement. And what is the kind of treatment that they should receive? And I think that's where the concept of civility is very important, that there should be limits on what we utter in public because they can be potentially destructive, and yet we live in a time where I think increasingly that speech is becoming coarse and disregards the citizens as someone who is really unimportant unless he or she agrees with me. So what I found was how do you preserve the notion that in dealing with fellow citizens that the debate should be sharp, it should be pointed, and yet at the same time respectful. So I did find that talking about citizenship, I think, particularly given the current circumstances, was the most challenging.
I think one of the things that informs that mentality of my neighbors, my fellow citizens are only those who agree with me. It comes from social media in many ways, right? I can curate my network of people very carefully, but that's not real life. You have to deal with what you've been given. As much as I'd love to choose my neighbors, I have great neighbors here, but there's always there's a risk. I'm going to be actually where I'm moving. I was going to be right next to a hospital, which will be interesting. But yeah, you end up with neighbors and you can't kick them out. How do you choose to love and be with people that you didn't choose? And that's part of life.
Well, it is, and I think I've often referred to the families and churches, for example, are splendid laboratories for learning to love people you don't necessarily like. And yet, it's really saying, okay, I think Augustine has that wonderful phrase, the bonds of imperfection.
Right.
And how do you begin to live that out? Because I think if you ignore those bonds of imperfection, those unchosen bonds of imperfection, I don't see how you can flourish, because that means that you've completely narrowed your range of affiliation, which was never intended by God to be that narrow.
Right. You'd be quite lonely if you only choose to love those people that you like all the time. Right.
And eventually you're probably going to be stuck with yourself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of people you don't like all the time, right?
Right.
That is very true. Now, part 3, again, I'm brushing quickly through this book. So those of you who are listening, please check out the book. There's a lot more to that relationship part. Let's look at part 3. It focuses on activities, including work, housework, homework, manners, appearance, eating, and leisure. And one of the more surprising inclusions here, and it seemed like you were cognizant of this, or at least it was surprising to me, was that of appearance. What was your goal in that specific chapter? And I also want to specifically encourage you to talk about what you meant by piety in that chapter, which I was surprised to find that there. But I certainly learned a lot from you. So what did you mean by that chapter?
Well, it kind of started off, it's one of those chapters that at the time, again, you think you're going to be thinking very clearly about it, and as you get into it, it becomes more and more murky, and you got to find a way out by the end of the chapter. But I was very taken by, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde's observation, that only shallow people never judge by appearance. And I think he's on to something, because by and large, when we deal with one another, all we can deal with is appearance. We never know each other fully. Only God knows us fully. So we can only deal with how we choose to disclose ourselves and present ourselves to others. And I think that what I really wanted to say with that appearance in terms of how it comes about with piety is, again, it's a way of expressing regard of the neighbor. That, in a sense, you don't project yourself of how you want to appear to yourself, but of the level of respect that you hold those that you are dealing with is really the principal part of appearance. So again, I spent a lot of time on talking about how does one dress. And if I show up to class every day, for example, in t-shirt and a dirty t-shirt and jeans, I think I'm saying something to my students of the level of regard that I hold them, that I don't even bother to try to present myself to them in some way that shows respect for them as students. I don't want to read too much into that, but I think it is a time where we have become unduly casual, and in doing that, what we're really projecting, what we're really presenting is a kind of not only disregard of the neighbor, but also, again, back to Murdoch's fat, relentless ego, that I don't have to bother about how I appear to others because it's all about me anyway.
Right.
So in appearance, what I'm saying is that in some sense, our appearance should also be formed by our faith of what is God calling me, how is God calling me to present? Because again, I think that whole notion of presentation now is becoming trivialized when we become, walking Facebooks, where everything on the Facebook page is a presentation of how we want to project ourselves. And in a sense, it does capture life, but it's a false sense of life. And again, I think we need to be attentive to appearance to simply guard against a notion that it doesn't really matter, so we can be as false as we want in that appearance. It's not that it's really a way of getting back of saying, yes, by and large, you and I deal with masked characters, but those masks can be either deceitful or they can be revealing.
So does that mean you're being disrespected if I'm wearing gym shorts and a t-shirt right now? I'm just kidding.
Well, I don't know. I can't see you.
Right. I mean, I have a radio face, so it's okay. But this is really interesting. I used to be an actor, not a professional actor, kind of more of a fake one. I acted like I was an actor, and it was amazing to me also how when you put on the costume, the difference it made in how you played the character, what was massive. And so there's also a part, and not only is it a love of neighbor, and again, I don't want to make this all about the self, but it's also striking that when you do care about your appearance, it doesn't just have a superficial effect on you. It actually impacts what you do. I mean, if I dress up to teach, and when I say I dress up, it's dress pants, dress shirt, no tie, because ties are oppressive, I've decided. But again, it says something about you and what you think about others. Now, how does that relate to piety in this regard?
Because I think it's the level of respect that you display in exactly what you were talking about and how you were dressing up. I mean, I've been struck oftentimes by people from the military or police force who use the phrase to respect the uniform. And when they're in uniform, that is also showing something to which their allegiance, their duty lies. And I think in much the same way, is how we present ourselves to others is also a reflection of our faith in God, because it is formative. I mean, like it or not, people judge. I mean, I think it's Clement of Alexandria who spends a lot of time telling Christians how to dress, how to compose themselves, because basically his advice is, like it or not, how people judge you is how they're going to judge the object of your faith as well. And it's something I think that we don't take with a sufficient degree of reflection is that how we present ourselves is also a presentation of our faith in Christ. And people will make judgments about that. I mean, like it or not, we are judged by our appearance.
Speaking of judgment, my favorite chapter is probably the one on eating, for the simple fact that it's by far my favorite part of the everyday. And depending on what you're eating, it's hard not to think about things divine. I recently had gelato. For those of you who've never had gelato, that's the closest you can get to heaven on earth. But I also really enjoyed, Brent, you're talking about cooking. Tell us more. What do you? First of all, what do you plan to cook for our conference in March? And then second, that chapter. It sounds like it was inspired by, in some ways, by your cooking, right? The realization that there's more to this than meets the eye. So I'd like you to just talk a little briefly about eating and what you're accomplishing in that chapter, and again, what you're going to cook in March.
Well, I'll start with the end. I'm not going to cook anything in March.
Oh, come on. All right, fine. All right, I'll feed you.
All right. Because, you always run the risk of food poisoning.
You're not licensed.
How it came about was, I'd say 10 or 12 years ago, I took up cooking as a hobby. Started doing more of it. And then I realized it was more than just a hobby. There was something going on here that eating is a very social act. That even if you're eating alone, you're still dependent upon a wide variety of other people. There's farmers and ranchers and truck drivers. Everyone who got this. No one can really supply all of their dietary needs on their own. They're completely dependent upon other people to do that. And to even be mindful of that when you're preparing a meal, I think is important. It's also a way that I discovered is that you really do have to remain focused on what you're doing when you're preparing a meal, because in the first place, almost any tool in the kitchen is potentially dangerous. And if you're not paying attention, you can lose a digit, because those knives are pretty sharp, or you can injure yourself. So you need to remain focused on what you're doing. What I discovered early on is, wait and drink the wine with dinner and not when you're preparing it.
Okay.
So there's that part. And then there's also the notion of saying when you're cooking for others is, what I discovered was you just sit there and wait for the other person to make the judgment on the meal, that you're no longer concerned about, is this something I like? It's what the other person might enjoy. Mm-hmm. So it's, again, a way of serving those needs. And then the amount of I would say, related kind of work is incredible to me. You have to carefully set the table. You have to wash up afterwards. And a lot of daily mundane kind of work goes in around the table. And at this point, I was very much informed by the work of Albert Borgman, where, you have also the fellowship at the table, so that eating is a means of social interaction and learning, the courtesies that go around the table, the etiquette and all is all very important. And again, my concern is that increasingly we live in a kind of culture that doesn't value dining. Really, what we do is graze. I think we lose an important part of human interaction, human flourishing, by simply neglecting a simple act of what does it mean to share a meal with others.
There is a point at which it's hard not to think of food as a love language. That's not one of the five, but it is. When you think of, when I was off at college and I would come home, if my mother or my grandmother would make me food, one of the ways that they would say, "Welcome home. I love you. I've missed you. Here's that food that I know you love." Right. And that to me is a beautiful example of how you're not just meeting a biological need. There's more to the story here. Speaking of stories, one of the things I passed over, we're not going to cover this here in the podcast, but I want to mention that one of the things Brent does through all these chapters is he relates a lot of what he's doing back to literature that he's read. Toward the end of almost every chapter, there's a book he's read, a novel, many of which I had never heard of in my life, which I think is a beautiful way to enter into the ordinary and into the challenges of thinking through this. I think it just as an analytical tool, as an explanatory tool, it was a really, really effective way of getting the point across, so that even if we couldn't objectify our own lives and see the ordinary in our own lives, that really was quite effective. And I want to ask this last question, and you can speak to whatever you want, but I thought it was interesting. Our friend Gilbert, I think you say his name, Mylander?
Yes.
Gilbert Mylander, writes that, he says, quote, "I hope that Waters will take no offense when I say that this book could not have been written by a young man." Now, aging, of course, is one of those ordinary aspects of life. But what do you, I mean, I think I see what he means by that. But do you think there's some truth to what he's saying there?
Oh, I think he's absolutely right. I couldn't have written this book except now that I'm old, because it's a retrospective book, not a prospective book. Fay Vincent, who was a commissioner of Major League Baseball and then became a columnist after he retired, years ago, wrote a very interesting column where he said, as you grow older, increasingly you live life in the rearview mirror. Now you keep moving forward, but you're still looking, in a sense, back. And that's what the book is about, is saying, okay, what have I learned, anything of value, as I come to the close of my career?
Yeah.
As I enter into a period of what O'Donovan calls entering into rest. How do you make those transitions? How do you reflect on this? So yeah, no, Gil's correct. I couldn't have written this as a young man, because all I would have been doing is guessing what these things would have been like. Yeah. And maybe I get them right, maybe I get them wrong. But it's just an opportunity where I think, and we don't take advantage of it, I think, enough in the culture, is to really reflect upon where have I been rather than where am I going. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of I think that's where tradition comes into the Ciceronian Society. What can we learn from tradition?
Yeah,
that's why we value the past, not because it's past, but because it teaches us something that's very important for the here and now.
It's interesting when you're, if you're in a job interview, right? One of the common questions is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself 10 years from now?
Yeah.
But we're interested, and that's not a stupid question, but an important question is, where were you 5 years ago? Where were you 10 years ago? How has that impacted you? Which is a very Ciceronian type question and very much related to what's going on in this book. Well, we've reached the end of our time together. Brent, thank you so much. This has been great. And take a look at his new book, Common Callings and Ordinary Virtues, published by Baker Academic. Very highly recommended. Thanks, Brent.
Thank you, Josh.
Now, you've been listening to The Sower, a production of the Ciceronian Society. If you've enjoyed this conversation and would like being in the company of thinkers like Brent, we invite you to join us for our next conference, March 9th through 11th, 2023, at Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina. Be sure to rate and review this podcast wherever you download it from, and share it with your friends, and check out our website at ciceroniansociety.org. Thank you.